This is Art Sense, a podcast focused on educating and informing listeners about the past, present, and future of art. I'm Craig Gould. On today's episode, I speak with author Rochelle Gurstein about her new book, Written in Water, The Ephemeral Life of the Classic in Art. Gurstein set out to explore and establish a solid foundation for the classic in the history of taste. However, to her surprise, that history instead revealed repeated episodes of soaring and falling reputations, rediscoveries of long-forgotten artists, and radical shifts in the canon, all of which went so completely against common knowledge that it was hard to believe it was true. In the conversation, Rochelle discusses this surprisingly fluid history of what is loved and respected in the history of art. And now, a conversation about the search for the classic exemplar with author Rochelle Gurstein. Rochelle Gurstein, thank you so much for joining me this week on the Art Sense podcast. Rochelle, you are the author of a new book, Written in Water, The Ephemeral Life of the Classic in Art. Rochelle, I've completed reading your book. It's very interesting to me, the person that lives and breathes and devours art content. But let's say you were sitting next to someone at a dinner party who has no idea what your book is about. How do you start to describe to them the premise that you spent all these years working to kind of flesh out?
I think what the best way for me to talk about my book is to start with the title. The title is Written in Water. And that sort of announces a U-turn in my thinking about what I thought I was doing when I was writing this book. I had set out, I had hoped to find that there was such a thing as a timeless universal classic. And I had imagined it was carved in stone. But history let me down. And every time I thought I was going to find a timeless classic, things that, today people would imagine Michelangelo's David is something that's always been beloved for centuries. It turned out it wasn't that he wasn't beloved, but that particular sculpture was regarded as primarily his juvenilia. And the Moses in Rome was the sculpture that people adored for hundreds of years. So that I saw that repeatedly. I found that with many other works that many of us believe are classics. So this made me have to, rethink what I thought I was going to do in this book. And one of the things that made me rethink is, where did we get the idea of a timeless universal classic? So that's I guess, a quick way of saying what I thought I was doing when I was writing this book.
I feel like each generation thinks that we have it all figured out and we know what the classics are. I think what was surprising reading your book is just how much opinion shifts from age to age. And the power winds up being in the hands of these very few people who write with an opinion and kind of shift cultural perceptions of not only contemporary work, but work from the past.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I felt in writing my book that there were really two sources that I was looking at. I first began thinking I was going to write a history of the idea of taste by looking at philosophers. This didn't get me very far. Not that the philosophers aren't brilliant, the 18th century great writers like Hume and Kant, but they didn't speak about the kinds of things I was interested in. And I came upon Sir Joshua Reynolds, someone who most people know, if they know at all, as a portrait painter of the 18th century. And he had been the first president of the Royal Academy and delivered these lectures called the Discourses when they were published. When I found his writing, I found an artist speaking to artists about the practice of art. This became a generative source for me. So I looked in my book at what artists said about works of art and their ideas about what they were doing, as well as, you say, people who became very influential, people like John Ruskin, Roger Fry, Walter Pater, well-known people, or people who once were well-known, and what their responses were to art. So, as you say, it's a small number of people who are writing these books, and they do have what feels like an enormous power. But I really felt, and this interested me deeply, that what keeps a classic alive, or what makes a classic, is the artist's practice. As long as the artists, sculptors, painters, feel that they're continuous with the work that came before them, that those works will endure. It's not arbitrary, it's not subjective. It really is a kind of objective standard. What I mean by that is when Reynolds was writing about who the great exemplars of art were, he would always speak about Raphael and Michelangelo. This is the late 18th century. And he would speak about them as contemporaries and instruct the artists who were in his audience when he gave these lectures to regard them as rivals whom they need to at least equal, and if you were really good, perhaps you would surpass. What happened by the 19th century, artists felt like their practice had become barren, and that they had great difficulty pursuing the kinds of aims and aspirations that had once been the classical practice. This is what, to me, was a great surprise, that the impetus always came from the artists trying to extend their practice, and when they couldn't, the very best of them innovated, which would then introduce new standards of arts, new classics, a new canon.
In the book, there's kind of a thread that you go back to from the beginning to the end with one particular sculpture, the Venus de Medici. It's a really interesting illustration of how perceptions can change. And the way you tell the story, even your perception of a story about the Venus de Medici, seems to change as you learn and dive more into all of this content.
Yeah, I mean, this was one of the starting points of my book, a sculpture that I think the vast majority of us who care about art don't know anymore. I had come across this quotation in a book I read many years ago about a Yankee, that's how he was described, meeting a group of very cultivated Englishmen. The one Englishman approaches him and says, "Oh, I hear you've just been to Florence the Beautiful. You must have been in raptures over the Venus." And the Yankee, much to the shock of the cultivated Englishman, says, "I don't care much about those stone gals." When I first read this, I thought, well, that's funny. It's amusing. And the response of the Englishman was to basically faint. He couldn't believe his ears. And he said something that was quite extraordinary and unusual to us moderns. He said that this American, this Yankee, was provincial, and that he was suffering from egoism and uncivism. Now, that response to a judgment of taste was a revelation to me. I don't think anyone today would ever say something like that. And this put me on a kind of search for the language. What world would that language make sense in? And what was this sculpture, which I didn't know? So I have many art books at home, as I'm sure I can see, and you do too. And I started looking for images of it. I began thinking, well, was this really the Venus de Milo? And somehow the name had changed. But it turned out that the sculpture does exist. Anyone who has been to the Uffizi and has seen the room, that octagonal-shaped room, the Tribuna, has actually seen this sculpture. From the time it was found in the Renaissance until the end of the 19th century, it was the most beloved ancient sculpture. Poets wrote about it. All travelers went to see it. They made pilgrimages. It was reproduced more than any other sculpture. Artists drew pictures of it. And we don't know it anymore. So this was a mystery for me. And one of the reasons we don't know it today is that it turned out to be a Roman copy of a missing Greek original, the Aphrodite of Cnidos. From the Renaissance until the close of the 19th century, the distinction between copy and original meant virtually nothing, which was another shock to my understanding, since that's such an important distinction today. So trying to figure that out, why a sculpture that was so beloved, I mean, more famous than the Mona Lisa, more famous than any Botticelli painting, it's hard to really recapture that. I'm not trained as an art historian. I'm trained as a historian of ideas. So I came to this material as a kind of art lover, cultivated every person. And so many of my standard kinds of interpretations turned out to be wrong. I think that was as I keep saying, I was startled at every turn in writing this book. And the Venus the Venus in
Right.
Uffizi, it turned out to be a sculpture that when I did see it, my husband and I went to visit it. This was maybe 30 years ago, or maybe not that long, maybe 20 years ago. And we were the only ones looking at it. No one bothered to see it. Today, the Uffizi has turned the room, the tribuna, into a historical room. You can no longer enter it. It's roped off, which was astonishing to me when I went there last. And so people, I mean, it's just one more thing in that room that nobody cares about. A sad, poignant story, the mystery of the Venus de Medici and what can happen to things that were so well loved.
You're a historian of thoughts, right? And it's just so interesting, and it's just kind of frustrating to see how the thoughts shift and change from century to century. And it's particularly frustrating to read the accounts of frescoes falling out of fashion and wanting to be painted over to brighten the interior of a cathedral and or replaced by something that would seem more of the fashion of a particular century than what Raphael or Michelangelo would have made. It's really interesting to see those dialogues.
Yes. Again, another startling discovery for me was that when one reads Giorgio Vasari's famous book, The Lives of Artists, Sculptors, and Architects, that was published in the Renaissance, I was reading an 1850 edition. It was the first time that it was translated into English by a woman named Mrs. Foster, as she is known. I could find nothing about her. She had many, many, many footnotes. And when she would be translating a beautiful passage of Vasari, where he's describing, the most wondrous, it sounds like the most wondrous image you could possibly imagine of some famous fresco of Giotto, or of, you can take your pick, Masaccio. It didn't matter who, all the artists that today many of us think of as the great, early Renaissance artists. She would have a footnote saying, missing, damaged, vanished, whitewashed over. And I was astonished. I mean, who knew this? And when I would look for images of it, I thought, well, maybe she was wrong about this. You can't find them because they don't exist anymore. So this was, again, another great mystery to me, that these early Italian painters, whom many modern art lovers love more than anything, had been treated so roughly. And the reason I came upon this in the first place, I was reading Vasari, but also there was a rediscovery of these very artists, the early Italian painters in the 19th century. Again, I think our love for those painters makes us think that they were always loved. It turned out they were forgotten, yet another surprise, from the Renaissance through the 19th century, primarily because of, at least this is what I think happened, Vasari's account of art history was so compelling. And these early figures were seen as imperfect predecessors to Raphael and Michelangelo, that no one needed to look at them anymore, or the people who were popes and noblemen, aristocrats who were patrons of the church, thought nothing of destroying them or whitewashing them over to make room for Raphael, Michelangelo, and high Renaissance painting. So this was a sort of accidental discovery of mine by reading this early, actually it felt like a late translation of Vasari. That was something else. I had assumed that Vasari had been translated into English and French and German, I don't know, probably in the 16th century. It turned out that was late also, maybe as late as the late 18th and early 19th century. So as I say, I don't know that what I'm saying is news to art historians. I hope it is. I don't think that they get to their material the way I got to it. But I think for the ordinary art lover, I think that most people, when I've told them these stories, are as surprised as I am by what I found.
Sounds a bit like someone saying, well, why do I want to keep this old black and white television when I can get a 4K color television? Like, just the thought that, well, we have advanced to the point where if we're trying to impress upon our patrons and the worshipers a particular emotive quality and a call to worship, we want to hit them as strongly as we can. Work from 150 or 200 years ago isn't going to hit them as squarely as some Kodachrome new fresco that we can hit them with by a contemporary hand.
Yeah, I think at least a number of things were going on. In the 19th century, when there was this so-called rediscovery of what they were calling the early Christian painters, Ruskin was very important in this writing, and also a writer, a Frenchman who's been almost completely forgotten, A.F. Rio. There was a desire on the part of viewers, not only, I should say this first, not only were artists having a hard time keeping the classical practice of art alive, competing with Michelangelo and Raphael, but also viewers were finding that work cold. Well, not cold. It was beautiful, but not addressing this yearning for a deep experience with art. And the experience was going to be a religious one. There's religious revivals of all sorts in the first half of the 19th century. This led to a new appreciation of painting that Vasari and others had felt was dry, hard, flat. After seeing Raphael, Michelangelo, Leonardo, all the great Renaissance painters. So it's not just a desire for something new. It's that the early Christian painters addressed something in the 19th century emotional life psyche that the Renaissance did not, the High Renaissance. And there's a whole dispute about this, a very, very vitriolic dispute about which work is superior, the work of the Christian primitives, as they came to be called by later writers, and primitive meaning something original and good, or the beautiful, exquisite, graceful paintings of the High Renaissance. So the people who were alive during the High Renaissance, they of course wanted these new paintings that had perspective and new kinds of color and naturalism, and were influenced very much by humanist learning and the rediscovery of ancient sculptures. By the 19th century, that work is starting to be seen as artificial, affected, theatrical, and so on. And the early work is seen as pure Christian spirit. So there's, on the one hand, when the new work is coming in, as you say, it's like a color TV versus a black and white one. It's so vastly superior in terms of being spectacular and beautiful. But by the 19th century, that taste had yet again changed. And there's a rediscovery of all these artists whom many of us adore today, and a demotion at that moment of the High Renaissance. So this was all very disorienting to read. I really felt like there's a history of art that we know beginning in the 20th century of national schools and styles, and Baroque, Renaissance, all of these terms we have. And then there's a history of taste of what artists were doing and how art lovers felt about them. And I became fascinated by the second one over the first.
Well, when I first started reading your book, I felt like I was joining you on this journey, and we were going to figure out a formula for what the classic is. My first guesses were, well, we're going to settle somewhere on the natural versus the ideal. Well, one's going to weigh heavier than the other. And I think what we really see in your book is that it's a tennis ball that continues to get volleyed back and forth, this whole battle between the natural and the ideal.
Yes, that's actually a wonderful way of talking about it, what you just said. As I say, I was surprised by many things. One of the things I came away believing is that there's been at least four major shifts in the way artists and art lovers regard works of art, and that they are almost mutually incommensurable, which lead to very vitriolic disputes. The first would be ancient art as trying to make sculptures that are so compelling to the gods that they will come down and inhabit them. And then Christian art is to try to make these heartfelt images that will stir piety in their viewers. Then in the Renaissance, that's not completely abandoned, but beauty and artistry and technical virtuosity enter, and the imitation of nature, where before that, that's not a concern. And then by the time we get to the end of the 19th century with writers like Roger Fry and Clive Bell, there's a real awareness that painters like Cezanne and modern painters are no longer imitating nature, that instead they are trying to make a self-contained, autonomous image within the picture plane. And all of that, what that brought to us is this extraordinary modernist painting. As we know, by the 1950s, that project seems to have reached an end with the New York School. And then the 60s until our own time, there's a complete break, not complete, but a very radical break with trying to make sculpture or painting as it was once made. I would say that all the work from antiquity to the 20th century, to the 1950s, looks more like one another than a work by Donald Judd or a performance by Alan Caprow. So this ping pong thing that you were describing, I've made it more, I've done it in terms of these kinds of segments, but of paradigms of art that compete. I think that the disputes we have today about what work should be in the museum, should it be social inclusiveness, should it be based on aesthetic value, is a latter day version of many of these disputes that I had been tracking in my book. And I was just, as you said, it feels like at least I'm glad to think, when you were reading it with me, reading the book, that you thought I'd actually come to some conclusion about this. The conclusion I came to, again, not the one I wanted, was that the classic was really a very ephemeral thing, that it is changing, the canon changes radically at different moments, and that we today who are arguing the culture wars, that we're very ignorant of just how ephemeral and unstable this history has been, that it's not written, it's not carved in stone, that we have many sort of red herrings and false idols in this disputes that we have today.
I was listening to a podcast just the other day about an exhibit of women artists' work, over hundreds of years, that's currently up in the National Gallery in London. There was a comment about discovering these women artists. Isn't it said that they weren't recognized in their own time? But the response was, well, actually, they were recognized in their own time, but it was later art historians who started omitting their existence. I think we see some germs of that in your work, and maybe not necessarily in the narrative of the female artists, but we see different art historians become power brokers and craft their own narrative that then winds up being the foundation for other people's thought, and things just kind of, like you say, ephemeral, they just kind of fall away to dust.
Yes. I mean, as a historian, we try to make a narrative that's based in generalizations. But when you're actually reading about people's lives and their work and what's happening at the moment, the disputes that they're part of, it's very particular and specific. So terms like romantic versus classic, I actually have a deeper training in literature as an undergraduate. And I had read books like M.H. Abrams' The Mirror and the Lamp, which is about the changing metaphor in romantic poetry, from the mirror being the mirror to nature, and the lamp being the artist's inner experience. M.H. Abrams, a brilliant literary historian, makes a very compelling case that in the first part of the 19th century, this is what this metaphor changes in English Romantic poets. This was in my mind when I came to Romantic versus Classic, those terms in painting, especially in French painting in the first part of the 19th century, Ingres versus Delacroix, these kinds of things, Poussin versus Rubens. It wasn't at all that metaphor. I mean, it meant something very, very different. So I bring this up in the context of what we expect to find, the kinds of generalizations that we come to when we come to works of art or write history, and then what actually happens when you're reading specific cases of it. So the artists who are remembered later are often the ones who innovated and became the artist, that the exemplar. That's what classic, I should have said this earlier, that's what classic initially meant, the exemplar of the practice. And so, I mean, you see this, as you're saying, with this rediscovery of women artists today. From what I can tell in reading Vasari and people who were making these canons early on, in the Renaissance, you don't see many women, I don't think you see any women in his history. But that doesn't mean they didn't exist. It means, well, I shouldn't say that. They probably didn't exist because they didn't have entry into that realm. But what matters, and I subscribe to this today, even though it's sort of gone out of fashion, are the people who set the terms of the art, the people who are the exemplars. And I think, again, there's not a lot of dispute about that. If you say who's the greatest Renaissance artist, most people today would say Michelangelo and Leonardo. They wouldn't say Raphael, which is another shock. Raphael was the main primary artist for 400 years. And the same thing, if you say who's the great modernist painter, many people would say Cezanne. No one's going to dispute that. Who's the greatest pop artist? People would say Warhol. So there's other people, obviously, who are making art, but they don't have that standing because they aren't the ones that artists feel they have to answer. And I would say that's probably true of a vast majority of women artists before the 20th century. And that's not I don't think that that's something we should regret. It's a fact, or maybe we should regret the fact of it, but it's not because there's many men, obviously, too, who don't have the standing of the women artists. So it's really who's the innovator, who sets the term for the practice of art that artists themselves feel they have to answer.
On a previous episode, I spoke with an author about a book entitled Falling Rocket. It was a court case between James McNeill Whistler and John Ruskin. You know, it's rather farcical to take to a courtroom a debate over the value of one person's art versus some exemplar. But I felt a sense of deja vu when I started reading about the Elgin marbles being taken before a tribunal to sort of sort out, do they have value, and does the government want to actually acquire these pieces for the British people? Can you tell us a little bit about that interesting chapter? Because the Elgin marbles are as much a topic today than they were a couple hundred years ago, but for totally different reasons, correct?
Right. I mean, this again is something a story I didn't know. As you say, today there's the huge dispute with the Greek government wanting to have the marbles back. They believe, well, they belong to them, and they want to reunite them with the other existing statues in Athens. I discovered, I'm trying to think how I even came across this dispute. I don't even remember at this point how I came across it. But the Elgin marbles came to England after the Napoleonic Wars. Elgin had been a ambassador to Turkey at the Ottoman Empire, and because of the Napoleonic Wars, there was the battle. All this I learned from my interest in the marbles, not my interest in history. There was the Battle of the Nile in 1798. The English had defeated the French, and the Ottoman Empire, the rulers, felt extremely grateful to the English. At that point, Elgin had people in, I guess, about 1802 in Athens, thinking that they would just make drawings of the marbles and maybe get some little pieces. But because of this victory of the English government of the English, they felt, as I said, grateful to the English and granted Elgin what was called a firman, which was a permit to take whatever he wanted, which is quite astonishing to us today. The legality of that was settled in these hearings that the Parliament had about whether to buy the marbles or not in 1816. There was no dispute then about who was the rightful owners of them. That today, of course, is the primary question, the only question. The question then was, how much should the government pay for them? Primarily because they weren't restored, they were weather beaten, and many people referred to them, many art lovers, as mutilated, a term that we would never, ever dream of. The love of sculpture that's not restored is a new taste. I mean, from the Renaissance until the 19th century, all sculpture was restored, polished, made whole when it was found. So this is one of the first times that anyone ever dreamt of buying sculpture that wasn't restored. And it was going to be bought for the benefit of English painters and sculptors and artists all over the world, that they could now come see the true relics of antiquity. Before that, as I had mentioned with the Venus de Medici, the sculptures that people adored were really all the sculptures that were found in Rome during the great building projects of the Renaissance. No one traveled. This, again, was a surprise to me. Virtually no Western grand tourists ever traveled to Greece because the Ottoman Empire was basically closed off to travelers. So people didn't know about Greek sculpture. When they spoke about ancient sculpture, they just said ancient or antique sculpture. No distinction between Roman and Greek, which today, of course, is a huge, important distinction, copies and originals. And so there's the hearings about whether to purchase the marbles or not. You can read them today, which I did. Artists, painters, and sculptors were called to testify. There was a question about whether they should be restored. The most famous sculptor at the time, Italian sculptor Antonio Canova, refused, saying it would be sacrilege to touch them with a chisel. And then the most famous English sculptor at the time, Flaxman, said he would not do it either because it would lead to a dispute about them, that they were better left unrestored. So this kind of testimony convinced the English Parliament to purchase them for the welfare of artists and to reflect well on the British government that they were supporting the arts. So that's completely different sensibility. They also, this is quite important, brought forward a new standard of beauty. One of the things that shocked people when they saw the Elgin marbles was that, as one sculptor said, the gods have veins, that they were used to looking at very smooth, fully restored marble. They had never seen the kind of realism, back to what you were saying about naturalism and idealism, of the sculptures, that they had these kind of casual poses. They said that they have ideal nature and the details of everyday life in them. So this led people to think there's another exemplar. It's no longer going to be just the Venus or the Apollo Belvedere or the Laocoon. Instead, now we have the real thing.
So they had a hard time figuring out what sort of box to put them in, because I think some people questioned their authenticity. Are they copies, or where to put them in the history of all that, because of just how humanist the depictions were, right? It may be that it was a result of so many things being sanded down and brightened up in the quote unquote restoration process. It was a bit of a shock for some of these quote unquote experts to see these humanist, naturalistic touches on these depictions of what were to be gods.
Absolutely. I mean, this was before that time. As you say, the sculptures, when they were restored, were very much sanded, polished, had beautiful, perfect surfaces. Nothing was weather beaten. Nothing was left in a fragmented form or mutilated form, as it was called. And then to see that as the sculptor said that the gods have veins. That line really resonated with me. They weren't supposed to. People like Reynolds, Samuel Johnson, many 18th century writers across the board in England and in Germany had this idea of ideal beauty based on the ancient sculptures that they knew, which were the Roman sculptures that had been restored. So this is a beginning of a kind of paradigm shift. What surprised me was, even at the time, many or a number of experts and artists believed or knew that the Venus was a copy of a missing Greek original, but it didn't mean anything to them. They still went on to regard that sculpture as the great exemplar of beauty. The people, it didn't, I would have thought, given our present day beliefs and copies, originals, Greek, Roman, that moment might have led to a huge demotion of the Roman sculptures. It didn't. That was also something that I didn't expect to find. It wasn't really until the end of the 19th century, the more archaeological view of sculpture, that distinction started to matter to people. The great German art historian and archaeologist Adolf Furtwängler was one of the first to try to make that distinction. He wasn't trying to demote the Roman sculptures, but his book led to a sense that the Roman sculptures were inferior and copies are inferior to originals. But that took almost 100 years before that distinction meant anything to anyone, even after they saw the extraordinary Eldin marbles.
It is an interesting chapter that I've covered before when teaching art history. The fact that when we look at Roman sculpture, there are kind of two categories, the ones that have been classified as Greek copies and the ones that have been classified as kind of authentic Roman work. And the difference there is trying to assess which ones are kind of built on notions of the ideal versus naturalism. And that goes back to the fact that we have very few examples of authentic Greek sculpture because they did love to use bronze. And those bronze works, as societies progress, there wind up being wars. And, we love our sculptures, but you know what? If we can make arrow tips and swords out of a sculpture, we're going to melt it down. And so a lot of those works have kind of been lost, again, to time.
Yes.
And you can imagine, several hundred years ago, not knowing or understanding all the intricacies of how that would have manifested itself.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's a miracle that any of those bronze sculptures exist today, just for the reason you said, that they were melted down for war. The same thing when you're in a museum, you see any kind of silver settings or vessels from the past. They were melted down for war, but also for currency, gold. I mean, these things that are precious metals or that can be used for other things, that seems at different moments in time to have much more value than their aesthetic value, their artistic value. Yeah, I mean, that's another really startling thing about what happens to these objects. As I say, I began this book really hoping to find that things exist over time, that they last, that they endure. That idea mattered to me deeply as a secular person. I really grew up believing that culture can be not a substitute religion. It fails, but can give us some kind of permanence and stability. That the idea that I referred to in my book of Hannah Arendt's of making a common world that endures, outlasts the makers, the original people who made them, that this is what culture makes possible. I ended up believing, even though I've said so much about the classic disappearing, we're talking about this at great length, I did end up in the end believing that we do have an idea of a classic. All the things that all the people have ever said about the Venus de Medici when they were in front of that sculpture. I've recovered many of them in my book. And I feel that if we know that history, and when we go to those works of art, if those many, many, many impressions are in our mind, It keeps the work of art alive in a very deep, deep, deep way, and the people who wrote about it. And I feel that's what I've ended up believing a classic is. It's everything that extraordinary works of art that people have returned to over and over again have said about it. That this is the way to make a common world. It's not timeless and universal in the way that I had expected, but it's a very enlarging, deepening, enriching experience. At least that's been my feeling. I had no relationship to that sculpture, and now when I've looked at it, I was in Florence 2 years ago. Even though I couldn't get in front of it because of the way the room is closed off, I feel all those voices and impressions in me when I look at that work of art, and I'm grateful for that. I really, yeah.
I love that the last fourth of the book, you're kind of taking us through all the rapid changes in perceptions of art and art history that come along with postmodernism, post-impressionism. And it makes me think, just yesterday, I was cleaning out a closet and I came across an art history book, which was kind of proclaimed in its title, The History of Art. And it was published in 1970. And I saw it on a shelf next to a contemporary gardener's textbook. And it was about half as thick as the contemporary. As I leafed through it, it proclaimed to be the history of art, but what it really was the history of Western art. And so it just makes me think how we think differently in a post-impressionism, postmodern judgment of what art is and where it finds value. It aids and assists in expanding the canon and appreciating works of societies that had been under-recognized before.
Yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, the love of non-Western art is a recent taste that comes with. I encountered it most fully in the writings of Roger Fry, his book Vision and Design, essays that were published in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. He's writing about, he loves modern art. He himself is a modern painter. Modern art for him is post-impressionism. That's his term. He invented it. And he is one of the first people to be able to appreciate art without knowing anything about it, about the term significant form, aesthetic value, aesthetic autonomy. All these terms were created by his friend Clive Bell, and he speaks at great length about these. Once one doesn't need to know the Christian stories or the Greek myths, or I should say, not only not know, when the viewer has rejected it, forgotten it, feels it's irrelevant, that those works still exist in museums and churches, and these new modern viewers began to appreciate them for their significant form, their aesthetic value, and felt that this gave rise to some new response, aesthetic emotion that was deeper, richer, much more important than any kind of relationship people had to beauty. Once there was this notion that you could look at a work of art for its form, this opened up realms of art that before had been in ethnographical museums, whether it was African sculpture, Mayan objects, Japanese screens, Chinese bowls. Fry wrote about all of these things. They were being exhibited for the first time in his era, and he felt they were on a par with the great masterpieces of Western art. The idea of the modern our modern canon really begins with post-impressionism, this way of seeing that it enables people to see works that previously were thought of, as I say, as ethnography, as art. And there's a migration of many of those works from one kind of museum to art museums. So this is something that I think the expansion of what was now a candidate for aesthetic appreciation is much larger than anything that's going on today. People are, of course, very upset about, or there's a dispute about what work should be in the museum today. how should the canon, so-called, be enlarged? To me, that's much less radical than this huge enlargement of what qualified as art because of significant form. And of course, the irony of it is today significant form is under attack as being elitist, not paying attention to context, which is all true. I mean, it's true, it doesn't pay attention to context, but it's certainly opened up a new kind of aesthetic experience for those of us who do have that experience that's unmatched by other forms of aesthetic appreciation.
You mentioned context there, and it reminds me, I can't remember which art historian had such a hot opinion about Byzantine art. That their opinions were so strong, it makes me surprised that that work wasn't totally disregarded. I mean, the work of the Byzantine and the icons, it was intended as a move away from the possibility of creating graven images to a formula that would be a call to worship instead of a realistic depiction. And that context just seemed to be lost on, again, I can't remember which historian was writing so vehemently about, I believe they mentioned, kind of in the same breath, the terrible works of the Byzantine and the Egyptian, who both worked within formulas for their depictions.
There's certainly A.F. Rio talks about.
I think it was Rio.
Yeah, that he's the one who is trying to write a history of the poetry of Christian art, and anything that comes before that, before Duccio, Cimabue, Giotto. Is for him, he talks about them as green, cadaverous figures.
Yes.
And he's revolted by them, as was Vasari. This is where the two of them intersect. It's probably the only point that they intersect in their opinion of things. They know nothing about that work. The work that matters to them is this. Trying to think of, you think of why that work wouldn't have mattered to them, or why they found it so repulsive. It's a good question. I'm not sure. I don't know the answer. I mean, one of the things that was interesting to me in Rio's writing, he was trying to. That dispute comes up when he's saying, why is Christ depicted as a green cadaverous body with blood dripping out of him, and he tries to recapture. I'm not sure if it's maybe the 4th or 5th century. There's dispute among church fathers: was Christ the most comely, handsome of man, or the most ordinary, homely of men? And it's a good question. I mean, I had never thought about how do you know what Christ or Mary or anyone looks like. As you say, there were sort of formulas with icons that they look a certain way, these figures. One of the great innovations of the High Renaissance is to start using contemporary people, including the artists themselves and their friends, to have a more variety in what these figures look like. So this question, I mean, it was not one that had occurred to me of how do they know what these figures look like, that they were trying to get the answer from the Bible itself. And the Byzantine side of that argument has him more as the less attractive, comely, non-comely, the cadaverous green figure, which for the Christians of the 19th century, I think that probably answers it. They found that repulsive. They had the idea of Christ as the most beautiful of men, God's son. So that's perhaps one of the reasons they found that work so absolutely repulsive. Their descriptions of it are quite extraordinary, of that earlier work. Yeah. All of that with Rio is so fascinating. The kinds of questions that he's asking are so interesting to me.
So, Rochelle, how long did you work on this book? Because when I read the book, it just seems like you really chipped away at a lot of different sources. Was it a long process for you?
Yes, I tell people my entire adult life. I had written a book a book that had originally been my dissertation for my PhD in history, called "The Repeal of Reticence," which is a history of changing ideas of public and private in American history. And one of the things that I wrote about was how people at the time, from in the 19th century, when they were describing which things should appear in public and which things should appear stay in private, they used the term taste, the judgment of taste, repeatedly. I That was very interesting to me, and I recaptured those disputes as best I could. When I finished the book, I realized I hadn't really thought much enough about what they meant when they said taste. That was in the 1990s. At that time, of course, that was one of the first moments of the culture wars. And there were so many disputes about art going on that really interested me. I live in New York City. I know many artists. I care deeply about art. So these questions were very alive for me. I tried, as I said, at first I was going to write a history of the philosophical notions of taste. I had many, many, many wrong turns, or false turns, I should say. And I abandoned the project at a different time. I wrote many different kinds of essays. I was interested in questions about ruins and fakes and aesthetic autonomy. So I wrote many different essays in the 90s and the first part of the 2000s that I had thought I would collect, and then and publish as a volume. And then when I tried to do that, I thought, oh, this isn't coherent. I should really try to write a book. So this was a long, long project, and I'd say at least 15 years that I knew what I was doing, that I had a path. And all this preparation, all my false turns or the essays I wrote, they were a very good foundation for me. And as I say, I'm not an art historian, so I was coming to this material really as someone who had a general knowledge of art, but not as someone who had read the literature. And I really focused more on primary sources. I read secondary sources from time to time, but my interest, as someone who knew nothing about what people actually said at the time, was to try to recapture as best I could the languages of the 18th and 19th century and try to understand what mattered to the people, both artists and art lovers and critics at the time. It was a very long project.
No, just hearing you talk about all the essays on taste, it just reminds me just how in the last year or two, I've just heard a much broader dialogue around the term connoisseurship.
Mm.
People are asking about taste making, and is there a place, and can you really differentiate and what informs one opinion versus another? So maybe it's time to revisit and dust off some of that work, because it's a conversation I've been hearing more in the last couple of years that I just really hadn't heard a lot of before that.
I'm interested to hear that. I didn't know that. I mean, about connoisseurship in terms of work of the past and trying to understand it, or more just in today's sense of looking at works of art and trying to determine what they're seeing.
I think today, if we examine things correctly, it's, we should probably frame it in terms of how connoisseurship has played a part in the past as well.
Do you think it's because there's more figurative art lately? I mean, when you think of a Warhol or a Judd, it's the aesthetic question of connoisseurship doesn't play as a very large role, or conceptual art. That wasn't their concern. But there seems to have been a return of a lot of figurative painting now. And I wonder if that requires more talk about taste.
I think it may have to do with relativism and people entering the art world and being overwhelmed by the volume of work that is available to them. In that if you're a new collector, you don't know where to start and you don't know if you can trust your gut instinct. I need the help of an art advisor, a connoisseur that can help navigate for me. This is good and this is not. This might appeal to you as an enfant, but once your taste becomes more complex, you're not going to want the Happy Meal. You're going to want the sushi.
Yeah, right, right. Yeah, that I think that's right, what you just said.
Rochelle, I can't thank you enough for your time today. It was a very interesting read. I encourage people to examine your work. It is Written in Water, The Ephemeral Life of the Classic and Art, available now from Yale University Press. Thank you for your decades of work laying out this story.
Thank you. It was a wonderful conversation. I really enjoyed it.
That's all the time we have for this week. You've been listening to Art Sense. You can find the show on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you've enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe. And while you're there, please rate the show and leave a quick review. Your feedback is the key to other folks finding us. And if you'd like to see images related to the conversation, read the transcript, and find other bonus features, you can go to cambia.art and click on the podcast tab. If you'd like to reach out to me, you can email me at craig@cambia.art. Thanks for listening.